Welcome back to Guide to Brides, the wedding podcast. I hope all the wedding planning is going really well and you're on track with everything. Now, when we're planning our weddings, there are so many things to consider, from the venue to the flowers to the cake to the insurance, but there's probably one thing that you haven't considered yet, and it's probably worth just having a think about, and that is a prenuptial agreement. My guest today is Poppy Holmes from Penningtons Manches Cooper, and she's here to talk all about this key family law service. Poppy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, hello. Thank you for having me on the podcast. My name's Poppy. As you said, I am a family lawyer at Penningtons, and I do a whole range of family law matters, one of which is prenuptial agreements, which we're going to discuss today.
Yes, and prenups, they're one of those things that you can have or you can decide against having. Is there anything we should be aware of in terms of a prenup before we even talk about what they are?
I think they are really important documents that people need to consider really carefully, and I think before thinking about whether or not you want to get one, you need to actually feel comfortable enough with your partner to have a discussion about finances and what that might look like. And so really it's just about being open and making sure that, you know, you're happy to have the conversation before you actually start the process of looking into prenups.
That's a really good tip, I think, because, you know, why are we getting married to this person if we're not happy talking about things like finances?
Exactly.
So, yeah, even though it's an awkward conversation, and we'll come on to that in a minute, it's probably one of those things that we should be discussing regardless, isn't it?
Definitely.
Fabulous. So before we go any further, let's dive into those big questions then. What is a prenup? What is a prenup?
So it's essentially just a document, an agreement between two parties who are planning on getting married or entering into a civil ceremony. And it's just a document that essentially outlines everything that you may want to happen with your assets, your liabilities. If in the unfortunate event, you know, the marriage or civil partnership were to come to an end, then you've got a document that outlines the agreement and how you wish to divide all of your assets and liabilities.
Okay, fantastic. And we're going to talk a little bit about like the frequently asked questions around prenups towards the end, aren't we? But it's not exactly the most romantic of things to be talking about when planning a wedding. So why would someone consider a prenup?
So I think everybody should really consider a prenup. People consider them for a variety of reasons. There are lots of things that you can include in a prenup. I think if you're ever thinking about, you know, in the relationship earning money or owning a property, starting a business, or even having children, I think things like this are topics that, you know, you really should discuss and consider putting into a prenup. You obviously, if you're entering into a relationship with property and assets that you already own, then there might be that want to protect those if anything were to happen in the future.
Can you give an example of a scenario where that might be the case?
So for example, if you're on your second marriage, let's say, and you've already got multiple properties, and you want to protect them for maybe children of your first marriage, and not necessarily want to divide them equally in your second marriage. You might be slightly older. That might be a good example of when you want a prenuptial agreement. But also if, you know, even if you are young and your parents maybe have passed, or you've inherited some property or some assets, then that's a good time to think about getting a prenuptial agreement.
Okay, but and the thing that was interesting to me like a few moments ago was you mentioned the consideration of if you were choosing to have children. Now, you know, we hear about prenups all the time with the rich and famous. I mean, there's you know, Kim Kardashian, Kanye West, that kind of agreement was always present for them because they were both had their own assets.
Yes.
But like the normal person, if you will, like myself, why would I consider a prenuptial agreement if in the event of having children? Why is that beneficial?
So it's really beneficial because let's say, for example, you are a couple who both have really good careers. Maybe you're both doctors and you're on the same playing field, you earn the same amount of money and you both want to progress your career, but then you decide to have children and one of you become a primary carer, you have to do more of the caring, looking after the children, and you don't have that opportunity to go out and work and put money into savings and pensions, then it's really important to incorporate that into your prenuptial agreement, because it wouldn't necessarily be fair if anything were to happen for the person who has gone out and maybe what they're known as the breadwinner, who have gone out and earned all the money. It's not necessarily fair that then if you were to separate, they had all of that in their prenuptial agreement, that they were going to keep everything, and then it leaves the person who has had to stay at home with nothing. The courts very much see, being the stay-at-home parent in the exact same capacity as the breadwinner, so the person going out and earning. So they actually look at those contributions to the marriage in the same way, and so it's an important consideration when drafting the prenuptial agreement.
Fantastic. And what else can you put into a prenuptial agreement? I mean, is there a set format, or is there a case? Is it a case of it's all to do with finances, or is there various other things that we could put in there?
So they are completely bespoke documents. They are drawn up by solicitors.
So they're not a set format at all.
Not set format. So there are precedents that we can follow, but actually the lawyers get really creative with the documents. We can kind of draw them up how we want, and include the needs of the specific couple. Obviously, people's circumstances change, and people have very different situations. Some people want a prenuptial agreement just for a couple of assets, and some people are entering into a marriage or a civil partnership with a wealth of assets, portfolios, investments, shares, lots of savings, maybe trusts that have been set up, and all of those things should go into a prenuptial agreement. So you can also deal with any debts, liabilities, and if there's any business interests, they can also all go into a prenuptial agreement.
That's all really good to know, of like what can be put into a prenup. Is there anything that can't be put? Because I imagine like there's that is such a wide breadth of things. Is there anything that just can't be put in there that is? I guess there's so many unknowns when you go into this kind of thing.
So most things can go into a prenup, but obviously there are certain things that can't. You can't put in any clauses that would break the law somehow. You can't specifically state that you don't want the court to make any financial orders on divorce, so you can't specifically, prevent somebody from making an application if there were to be a separation. But the main thing that can't really go into prenuptial agreements are practical arrangements for children. So that's kind of entirely separate, and you can't say, on divorce, then I will be the primary carer and you can stay at home or see the kids every other weekend. Those kinds of agreements wouldn't go in there. You also can't put anything in that would be of detriment to the children, so you can't restrict financial provisions for the kids, or anything that would negatively impact children, because obviously maybe if you've not had the children yet, you are not going to know what their needs are going to be later down the line, and so you can't cater for that in a prenuptial agreement. So
I guess would you put that under an umbrella term of like the unknown?
Okay. I would suppose so. And also I would say that it probably is wise to put into the prenuptial agreement some review clauses. So in the event of having a child or having children, then you can review the prenuptial agreement again and then sign it again under the term postnuptial agreement.
Okay, can you explain the difference then between a prenuptial agreement and a postnuptial agreement? Sorry, that one just came up for me.
That's right. So a prenuptial agreement is, it's kind of what it says on the tin. It's prenuptial, so it's before your wedding, and then postnuptial is after your wedding. So people do decide to, and I think we come on to discuss timings and things, but if you are really pushed for time, then it's always good to sign a postnuptial agreement after the wedding and after the civil ceremony, so that it's all just extra protected, and if it were to ever be in dispute, then you can prove that you still had the intentions after the big day, as you wanted before the big day as well.
Okay, fantastic. As you say, we are going to go on to timings, because that's one of your FAQs, isn't it? So we'll go on to that in a minute. What about internationally? I mean, like, for example, it doesn't really apply to me, but if I were to own a house somewhere overseas, the laws are going to be different, aren't they? So how does that affect your prenup in the UK?
Yes. So in other countries, prenuptial agreements might be binding, but it's really important that either you or your spouse have property or assets or bank accounts abroad, anything like that, or even if you're planning on, maybe living in a different country in the future, or if England isn't your home, if you're not domiciled in England and you're just living here, then it's always really important to seek legal advice from lawyers in those individual countries, because if the prenuptial agreement has been drafted in England and Wales, then we can give you advice on whether a mirror agreement is necessary to make that applicable in any other international countries.
So what is a mirror agreement then?
So it's essentially a document that reflects the same agreement, just as per the laws in that other country.
Okay, so it's like this is the document that we are submitting, say, and then this other document is for the other country. So it's, you might, for example, if you have assets in 3 different countries, you might need 3 different mirror agreements.
Potentially. Sometimes they can come under the same agreement, but it really, really depends on the country and the assets.
And is that something that you guys at Penningtons would be able to support with and be able to research on behalf of the client? Or
yes, so we have quite good connections with other lawyers, including international lawyers, so we can point clients in the right direction of different lawyers to seek advice from, and we can also help with what the laws in relation to prenuptial agreements mean in different countries.
So now that we've looked at what prenuptials are and answered those really big questions, Poppy has very helpfully supplied us with the FAQs that you guys get asked quite a lot. How many times do you think these FAQs come up for you?
Very frequently. Very frequently.
Like every meeting?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so the first one on the list, are prenups legally binding?
So this one has rather annoying answer.
Okay. That's going to mean it's a yes and a no.
Yes. So it really depends. I mean, the short answer is no. It is not possible within the laws of England and Wales to have a fully legally binding agreement, but the law in this area has hugely developed since a big Supreme Court case in 2010. And since that decision, judges now look at agreements and largely uphold them within the courts if, a variety of things have taken place prior to getting the agreement signed and finalised. For example, a judge will look at when it was signed, have the parties entered into it freely, at their own will, and have the opportunity to really think about it, and they aren't being forced or under any pressure or duress to enter into it or sign anything. Another good example is that both parties need to have all of the necessary information when they're going into it. So when we're drafting prenuptial agreements, we go through a process called financial disclosure, and that's a process by which both parties will provide us with all information on all of the assets they own, or the amounts in their bank accounts, if they own any shares or investments, how much their pensions are worth at the time, and also if they have any liabilities. And what will happen is parties will exchange that information with each other, and you also have to be willing to answer questions about it. If you think something seems a bit unusual or out of place, then there's a process of questioning as well, and it's all part of the negotiations. So that's really important, because people really do need to know the value of what their potential claim would look like if anything were to break down in the marriage or the civil partnership. So that's a really important point to consider.
Okay, and I think there was a question that I had as you were talking there. Does that mean that if, say, the worst happens and you decide to get a divorce, what then happens if you no longer agree with the prenup? Does it still stand, or can it be wiped out? What is the process there?
So if if you entered into it with all of these things, so the other point is both having independent legal advice, and overall, as long as you've entered it knowing what the position was at the time, knowing what the finances looked like, then a court would uphold the prenuptial agreement if it was broadly fair at the time, and if it's fair now. So, for example, if you were to separate and then you say, actually, no, I've changed my mind, I'm just going to go and argue against it. You won't necessarily get that opportunity unless there is a specific reason for it. So it's why it's so important that the agreement is drafted correctly and looks at how fair the agreement is, because if on the breakdown of the marriage or the civil partnership, then it leaves maybe one party without a home, or it leaves one party like with nothing and the other has absolutely everything, then that's when a judge would look at it and say, actually, it wasn't fair when it was drawn up. But no, you can't just change your mind if you're not happy with it on separation.
And I guess the other question that's drawn from what you just said there is if your circumstances change, and people are married for a very long time, hopefully you won't have to go through this process. However, if for example life has changed significantly over 10 years and that is the point when the marriage breaks down, and you're in a very different scenario to where you were previously, what happens then? Is it still reassessed in the same way?
So the parties can make an application to have it looked at, and there will be an argument to have it reassessed, and that's when the judge will look at how fair it is, and if it caters for both parties' needs. It's why it's really important to get it drawn up properly and correctly, so that you do have all of these clauses contained within the agreement that have reviews. So if you planned on having one child and you end up having 4, then you've got a review in there, because obviously your situation will look very, very different. So that's why it's important it's drafted correctly. But yes, ultimately they are not 100% legally binding. So people do dispute them.
Okay, that's useful to know, I guess, to like if you're worried that situations could change, that actually it will always be upheld in the sense of it being fair, rather than just that's it done. And it's also a good way of maybe limiting people's needs. So the way it works at the moment, or if you didn't have a prenuptial agreement, is a judge would look at needs. It's quite complicated, I won't go into it, but there's sharing cases and needs cases, and sometimes we go through a process of looking at what a person reasonably needs, and you can restrict that in a prenuptial agreement and say, these are what I think their reasonable needs will be, and then if on separation they say, actually I think I need so much more, but at the time you've agreed that they're going to be your reasonable needs going forward, then it's quite hard to dispute. Okay, that's useful to know, and I guess that's why it's really important to get good legal advice on this. So you talked a lot about fairness in the last question. So can you give us an example of what wouldn't be fair?
Yes. So there are probably 2 aspects of looking at what is fair and isn't fair. So you've kind of got the needs case that I mentioned. So interestingly enough, family law at the moment, it's so subjective. You could go through a court process and one judge could say, this is your fair, reasonable needs. Maybe that's a 200k flat, and you could go to another judge and they say, actually you need a £500,000 house. And the law is so subjective in that sense that you really don't know what necessarily the outcome is going to be on when a judge makes a decision. And I think that's why prenuptial agreements are a good idea, because you can restrict needs. And then the other side of things are compensation. So this is why it's so important, if you are considering children, to make sure there is a section within the prenuptial agreement that does compensate for people who go off and miss out on their career and don't get that opportunity to climb the ladder in their career. As long as they are the word is compensated, but it's probably not a great word to use. But as
Yeah.
long as they are protected in that sense, and they're not going to come out with no pension and no savings and things like that, those would all seem that would not be fair if you were to exclude somebody completely just because they're bringing up the children. So they're the kind of things that wouldn't be fair.
Okay, so that's useful to know, I guess, in the sense of like, it's always going to be upheld if it is fair, and if it's not fair, it will be re-looked at.
Yes.
Yeah, that's the basic line, I would say.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So the next question on this list is, why should people get a prenuptial agreement?
So there are lots of reasons why people should get a prenuptial agreement, but I think the most important ones are that they give a lot more clarity and certainty in terms of the finances in the event of a divorce, and it's an effective way to protect any assets, and it gives you the ability to agree your own terms, decide how you want your finances to be divided or looked at, and it just avoids a judge imposing that on you on separation. And so it provides you both with some level of security that you know you're protected. The other reason that people should get a prenuptial agreement are because they actually tend to save money in the event of divorce, and that is because when you do get divorced, you have the cost of dividing all of your finances, and you might both be paying for solicitors to argue about the assets and the liabilities, and it can be quite an expensive and time-consuming process. And if you can't agree that between yourselves, then you might have to pay for a mediator to do it, or you might have to pay for solicitors to negotiate. And then in the worst case, you might end up in court proceedings, which ends up being extremely expensive.
Oh, yeah.
So prenuptial agreements are actually a more cost-effective way of dividing what the assets and liabilities might be on divorce. And a good example would be insurance. And all solicitors compare it to insurance.
Okay.
It's kind of like when you buy car insurance, you're not wanting to have an accident or ever have to actually use the insurance, but it's there as a security, and it's a more cost-effective way because you pay a small amount for insurance, but if you didn't have insurance, then you might have to pay a huge amount to replace a car.
Right.
So it's a similar thing with prenuptial agreements. You never want to really have to use them because obviously you don't want to separate and you don't want to get divorced, but they're there as a security blanket.
I really like the way that you compared it to insurance, because it does help with the click of what it means.
Yes.
Because I think there is that sort of taboo. It's a taboo topic, isn't it, in this industry, because of the fact it's sort of like preempting the worst.
Yeah.
But actually, describing it like insurance suggests that actually, like you say, you're just preparing.
Yeah.
You're not hoping for it to happen.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I do appreciate that circumstances change throughout a long relationship, but that's why it's always helpful to have review clauses in there as well. And yeah, it's definitely something. It's something that's really important, because what might have been fair when you drafted the agreement might not necessarily be fair towards the end of the relationship.
Yeah, and you talked a lot about fairness sort of previously, didn't you? So it's good to know that it's there just in case.
Yeah.
But you hope you never have to use it.
I hope you never have to use it. But if you don't have one, then you're completely reliant on the laws of England and Wales and a judge imposing something on you. And family law is so subjective, and what one judge might say one day is completely different to what a judge might say another day. And it goes back to the point that I mentioned to you about needs, and people look at needs in all different ways. So yeah, it's really like a security insurance for you.
I like that way of describing it. Okay, next question on my list is, this is an awkward conversation to have, especially when say your partner's like proposed 2 months ago. So how do you start that conversation?
It is super awkward and uncomfortable, especially when, you know, people get engaged and they're so excited, and the first thing they want to do is, you know, plan the big day, and, you know, you're in this kind of little love bubble, which you kind of want to stay in. And you should stay in it. Yeah. You should just have practical conversations within that. And it's really, really hard because nobody wants to be the first to say, actually, we've just got engaged, but let's sit down and talk about finances and let's talk about prenuptial agreements. But it's something that I'm a strong believer that you should be able to speak about with your partner. And I appreciate it's an uncomfortable topic and it's tricky. But if you can tackle that conversation with your partner and get through it, and, you know, if you discuss it and then decide not to have a prenuptial agreement, then I'm just happy that you're able to have that conversation openly with your partner. I think it's really important to go into a marriage, you know, knowing what the finances look like and, you know, discussing whether you want children or not and what that will look like, and, you know, whether what you want to do with certain properties and assets, and it's just an important conversation to have.
Yeah, definitely. It definitely sounds like one of those conversations that if you can't have it, then why are you getting married to this person?
Yes. Yeah. I completely agree.
But it's a conversation that kind of needs to happen.
And, you know, sometimes it might just be a case of saying, look, let's talk about this. Let's talk about our prenuptial agreement and our finances. But I don't want to be discussing it every day at home. Or, you know, it's not something that maybe, you know, especially when there's negotiations taking place, it might be quite sensible just to set some boundaries and say, look, we can discuss it. And as soon as we're, you know, feeling uncomfortable or don't want to discuss it anymore, let's speak to our individual solicitors and they can negotiate the agreement. So as long as you go to a solicitor and say, look, this is what I want our agreement to look like, this is what I want to be protected, and then your solicitor can do the awkward conversations with their solicitor, so you don't have to worry about that.
Okay, yeah, that's really nice to know, is that like your solicitor, I guess, is in your corner and theirs is in their corner.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's like they can do that hard, horrible work for you.
The uncomfortable bit. But it's not so uncomfortable for us.
Yeah, well, you're just doing it professionally, aren't you? So, but for when you're doing it with your romantic partner, it's quite different.
Mood down.
Yeah. Yeah, it does bring the mood down. That is a great way of describing it. Important conversation to have will bring the mood down. That should be the tagline for
definitely.
Okay, next question. How much does a prenup cost?
So this is another question where it's difficult to answer because it does completely depend. It depends on the local market and the different rates of solicitors. So solicitors usually have an hourly rate and that is usually dependent on seniority. So it's between maybe, let's say, £150 per hour for your junior lawyers, and then up to over £500 per hour for your more senior lawyers. And usually you'll contact a firm and they will give you a range, so a good estimate of what it's likely to cost, and that estimate will depend on who they plan on drafting the agreement, how long it's going to take. It also depends on the assets. If you've got complicated assets, it's obviously going to take a lot longer to draft the agreement, and then it's going to be a bit more expensive. Some firms might offer a fixed fee, but I think the majority would do it on an hourly rate. So it's worth just making some inquiries and seeing roughly what people are going to charge for one. But it goes back to the insurance point, doesn't it? It's, you know, it may seem like a lot in the short term, but actually, if you've got millions of pounds worth of assets, which your everyday person does not, but if they do, then it's a small price to pay to protect those.
Yeah, and I guess for the sort of average person, it's probably going to cost a lot less in comparison to sort of the millionaires that will be having a prenup as well. So it's worth getting the inquiry at least to understand the approximate cost.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, the next one. When should you start thinking about or getting a solicitor for a prenup?
So this again is not the most romantic answer, shall we say? But I would say very soon after engagement.
Really?
Yeah. So, but obviously enjoy the engagement. I think it really depends on how quickly you're planning on getting married.
Okay.
You obviously have people, don't you, who get engaged and then, you know, want to do absolutely everything, get married super, super quickly.
Yeah, I mean, people can plan a wedding in 3 months if they want
Very
to.
impressive.
Yeah.
But, if they do, then, I would be saying, right, if you want to get married in 3 months' time, then you need to be on the phone to a lawyer immediately, like as soon as you get engaged. When we look at how likely they are to be upheld, they usually say that they should be signed at least 21 days prior to the wedding date. But obviously before that, you have the whole process of financial disclosure and negotiation and all the legal advice that we need to give. So I'd usually say maybe 6 months prior to wedding date, but really as soon as possible because it gives you the best opportunity. It's kind of like, when you plan a wedding and you get really excited and you buy a dress and, you've done your venue and your flowers, it's then not the best idea to suddenly 4 weeks before the wedding think, actually, I want a prenuptial agreement, because the other party, or both of you really, you're not going to, if you get to a really sticky point in negotiations, that's where the duress and the pressure comes in to sign the document, because obviously you're not going to turn around and say, actually, I'm going to cancel the wedding because we've not decided on the prenuptial agreement. It's just not going to happen. So that's why you really need to think about the timing, and it's really important to think about it early and just contact somebody early to get it all out in the open and drafted well in advance for the wedding. And then you get to be in the little wedding bubble before the wedding. Yeah. Don't have to worry about this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I really like that. And as you said, it wouldn't be upheld if it was clear that it was under duress or pressure. So
exactly. I mean, there is, sometimes you do have occasions where you're maybe 2 weeks away from the wedding and you've still not negotiated it. It's not the end of the world. You can still continue to negotiate and then sign it as a postnuptial agreement. Okay. And, sometimes we say that if you have signed it just before your wedding, it probably is best to get it also copied into a postnuptial agreement and then signed again, just to prove that, just because the wedding day is over, you're still in agreement to what you had agreed prior. So that's still a really good option. But yeah, if, the more time, the better.
Yeah. Okay, that's the more time, the better. That is the main point there.
Yeah.
That brings us to the end of my list of questions. But before we wrap up, what is your biggest tip for couples who are even just considering getting a prenup?
Biggest tip? I think one of the biggest issues we see as family lawyers is the fact that a lot of people don't know what their legal obligations are when they're entering into a marriage or a civil partnership. And it's strange because it's like, when you buy a house and you take out a mortgage, and when you're buying your house, they give you all of the legal information. They're like, this is how you're going to hold the title deeds. This is, what you need to do to comply with the mortgage obligations. And that if you don't pay your mortgage, your house is going to get repossessed. Whereas when you go into a marriage or a civil partnership, you don't get the legal information that you might need to know. So my biggest tip would be to discuss it, to think about it, and see if it's right for you as a couple to have a prenuptial agreement. And if it's not, then that is completely fine.
Yeah.
At least you've had the ability to have the uncomfortable discussion, and you've had the discussion. I think the worst thing you can do is not discuss it at all, and not consider it at all. But I think, if you consider it, that's the best thing.
Fantastic.
And maybe an additional tip would be, just be really kind to each other when you're discussing it.
Yeah. This is not one to have after a few glasses of wine.
Yes. Yeah. Just sit down in a room and, if you can't agree, get somebody else to do the discussions for you. Instruct a solicitor to help you with it. But yeah, I mean, ultimately you enter into them because you love each other and you want to protect each other on separation if that were to happen. So just be kind when you're discussing, and
yeah, I really like that tip. It's like, this is not something that is supposed to be negative. This is something that is designed because you want to protect each other, and I really like that. I think it's a lovely positive
note to end on
for us to finish the podcast on. So thank you so much, Poppy. I really appreciate you coming in and sharing your knowledge on this. I've certainly learned a lot about prenups, I have to say. So you can find out more about prenups on Penningtons Manches Cooper website. We're going to pop the link in the show notes for you, and any other related articles that are on Guides to Brides or on your site, we're going to make sure are in those those show notes as well, so you can have all of the information you need in order to start that awkward conversation.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
And good luck.
From Poppy, good luck. From me, good luck. But also be kind to each other, and happy wedding planning.